permission, I would like to start the recording. And so
Yeah.
we have a webinar with a new company that participates in Xculture for the first time. I call it Bob's Beer, but I believe the full name is actually longer, right? Can you explain?
The full name is Etxeco Bob's Beer. So it's a sort of Basque English name, yeah.
So what does this first word mean? Is it the location?
In Basque, Etxe means house. And when you use it in the form Etxeco, it means from the house or a homemade product, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's homemade, yeah. So for a craft product, it works quite well, yeah.
Okay, all right.
And that was people. Originally, I didn't want to, very sensitive for cultural appropriation. So it was very sensitive to that, but it was people here that said, no, you must have a way of actually linking it to the Pays Basque and use a Basque word to use in the product name. So that's what we did.
Talking about that, let's talk a little bit about the cultural background sort of your company. So you are English, right?
Yep.
You live in France, and the name of the company has the Basque connection. So you have a very multicultural company going on there. Can you tell us, before we start talking about business altogether, can you tell us a little bit more about how you ended up in France?
As I wrote in the document, my wife is French, and always we had a plan to come back and live in France. We met in France, and we always had a project to come back to France at some point. And things happened work-wise, which gave me an opportunity to do that. And we spent a long time deciding where we wanted to live in France. We came here to the Pays Basque, and then I think the same day, or one day, we were walking up in the mountains skiing, and the next day we were sunbathing on the beach. So then not too many places in the world where you can do that. So it's a pretty amazing place here, yeah.
Again, with the permission, before we get to all the business questions, can you talk a little bit more about that experience? Because again, Xculture is all about cultural differences, cultural experiences. So how long have you lived in France first?
I've been here for 15 years now.
So that's quite a long time. And then, so it sounds like you didn't come there for a job or school to a specific place. You were open to where you settle.
When we came here, I had no idea what I was going to do. I knew that I wanted to set up a business. I didn't know exactly what sort of business I wanted to set up. I looked at a number of different things, including some in sort of some more in technology based. I looked also at organic ice cream, and then decided to look in a lot more detail at making beer.
That actually, I didn't know that background. So you are saying that at some point, about 15 years ago, you just simply decided that I want to live in this country and I want to have my own business, but I don't know where exactly will I live. I don't know what exactly I will do. Maybe ice cream, maybe beer.
We knew where we wanted to live. I just didn't know what I was going to do. But I've spent a lot of time and a lot of energy actually trying to look at what I could do, and came up with the idea of doing beer, which took about a year to get off the ground. There's a lot of work to actually develop all the sort of the business plan for the brewery, and then also to look at where I could set it up and finding appropriate buildings, etc., etc.
Okay, very interesting. That's actually exciting. So that's a life of an entrepreneur, international one too.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about your business then. So what is the product, and anything else we need to know, or what makes it special? What do we need to know about your beer? A little bit maybe the history of the company. So please.
I think the most important thing is really comes back to the origins of the company, which is we were very focused on producing high quality craft beer rather than emulating the sort of beers that are made by the large industrial breweries in France. The beer market in France is not known for beer. It's countries that are more well known for beer, obviously England, Germany, Belgium, but France is not a beer country. And I always, when when I talk to people, I always say, you just have to go into a bar in France and listen to what people are ordering in the bar, and you realize how young the beer market still is in France, even now, because the majority of people walk into a bar and they'll just ask for a beer. They never state what sort of beer they want, or 95% of people will never say what sort of beer they want, and they can go from bar to bar and all they'll ask for is a beer. I can't hear you anymore.
Is it simply lack of experience and knowledge, or they just don't care, or what's the reason?
I think it's changing. I would say that it's a lack of knowledge. It's also a lack of experience in relation to tasting beers which have more character, which are of a higher quality. But I think one of the most interesting comments I heard was from a young woman who came to see me, and she walked through the door into the brewery and said, "I hate you." And I said, "Well, Joe, what have I done? What have I done?" And she said, "I used to drink Kronenberg, which is a very industrial beer here, and now I've had a few of your beers. I can't drink anything but your beer." So it all comes down to an experience. It's having an understanding of beer, and it's like wine. It's like any food or drink. The more you know about it, the more interested you are, or the more passionate you can become about that product. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So you're making beer. Tell us more about your product. How is it different from just beer?
Yeah, we're obviously producing at a very small scale. We're producing about 2,000 hectoliters a year, which is sort of medium size for a craft brewery. But compared to the large industrial breweries, it's really very, very, very small.
So
and the idea
hectoliters, so that's 2,100 liter.
So that's 200,000 liters.
A lot.
Yeah, it is quite a lot. Yeah, it is quite a lot in the year. Yeah.
So if a liter is 200,000 liters, that's I don't know how much the big brewers produce, but that's much more.
The big brewers will be producing more than that in a day. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or even in an hour in some cases. So it is quite small, but the whole focus is on producing small batch beers of quality with lots of different styles of beer. The predominant beer in France, given what I've just said, is for light blonde beers. And what we've tried to do is produce beers that have a lot more character to them. So in other words, they have either a mouthfeel or an aromatic side to them, and that are a lot more interesting to the beers that you'll find in most bars and shops in France.
And you make many different types, I assume. So it's not only just one recipe, there are different.
We've currently got, I think, 15 different beers. And we're phasing some of them out. There were experiments that we did in order to see whether or not we could target new markets with beers that were going to be of more interest to people that were real beer enthusiasts. But because, and it comes really back to the project here, because our market is very, very local, and because in essence we have a population within our catchment area of around a maximum of 500,000 people, it's small. And if we're working in a niche within a niche, it can be quite difficult to sell volumes of beer. So the tack we're taking now is that, yes, there is a market for specialist beers locally, a small market, but there's probably a bigger market outside the local area in regional and national markets. There are other breweries that are operating in these areas. So we want to try and do something that's very different, that gives us a way of slowly moving into regional and national markets by launching beers that are going to be of interest to real beer aficionados.
Can you tell us more about your production process? I assume you buy some ingredients. Basically, what do you buy? What do you make in-house? How does the whole thing work?
Okay. Well, the way I try and explain the difference between what we do and what big industrial breweries will do is time-based. So our brewing is quite long. It has a 6-week cycle to produce from brewing a brew day through to the fermentation, through to the conditioning, and then the putting the beer either in kegs or in bottles, and then conditioning those bottles is a 6-week cycle. Industrial brewers can probably do the same thing in 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
So first, the big difference in terms of time, in terms of the assets that we have here, in terms of the brew house, in terms of fermentation tanks, obviously with a cycle of 6 weeks, we're using our equipment at a far lower frequency than big brewers would be doing it. They'll be using everything, you know, as fast as they possibly can to throw through as much beer as possible, to throw out as much beer as possible. Whereas we've got far more of a qualitative or a quality aspect to everything we do rather than a quantity aspect to what we do. So it's quantitative rather than qualitative. Yeah.
So for those who don't know, can you explain briefly how beer is made? What are the
Sure, sure.
How is it
So
different from like winemaking, for example?
Basically, you've always got to think, as everyone watching this at some point will already know, that beer is an alcoholic drink. Yeah. And alcohol comes from the fermentation of sugar. And in the case of beer, that will come from your cereals. So that will come from your barley and wheat malts. And then you'll use with that, so that's your source of sugar. And also there are lots of other things that can come from that in terms of color, in terms of mouthfeel. You can have aromatic sides of malts as well. You then work with water, which is really important. So the quality of water. And here we're very lucky to have a natural source of water in the town we're brewing in. So it's good quality water. And then you've got hops, which are both bittering and also aromatic. So you use normally two different types of hops for the bittering and also the aromatic sides, or perhaps I think our most complicated beers are working with 4 or 5 hops. So they become quite complicated in terms of what ambitions are for those beers. So in essence, in terms of making beer, you'll mix the malts with hot water to try and extract the sugars, and then you'll transfer the sugary liquid, which is the wort, as you call it, into a copper or a big tank in which you boil the wort. And during the boil, you'll add in your bittering hops, and then after the boil, either another tank, which is called a whirlpool, you'll add your aromatic hops. And then the wort is reduced in temperature down to, depending on the fermentation temperature that you've got for the particular yeast that you're using, because that's another one of the 4 elements that you use for making beer that's very important. So in essence, you'll drop the temperature of the wort down to 20 degrees while you transfer it into a fermentation tank and while you add the yeast into the wort so that the fermentation starts within 12 hours of the transfer.
So when it's in that fermentation tank, it doesn't look very pretty, I assume, right? It's kind of like
you can't see anything because it's a big stainless steel tank. So you have to have a very good imagination in a brewery, because a lot of things happen in tanks. But in the fermentation tank, what in essence happens is that you have the yeast cells will start converting the sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And as they start doing that, they'll multiply. So there'll be more and more yeast cells, which will then attempt to convert all the fermentable sugars in the wort into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So there's a huge amount of activity in the fermentation tank as the fermentation progresses. Obviously, as part of that, we have to control the temperature of that because the fermentation process is exothermic, so it gives off a lot of heat. And we need to make sure that the temperature remains stable. Otherwise, you can start to generate off flavors in your beer, which are not wanted at all.
So once it's fermented, then you just filter it, or is there some sort
No, that's a particularity here in that we do not use filtering, we do not use pasteurization, for the very simple reason that we spend a long time choosing our raw materials, and to use a filtering process, which is a very aggressive mechanical process, you'll take out a lot of what you've just put into your beer. So we use what's called in French, which is a décantation à froid, So we'll use, we'll drop the temperature of the beer down to around 2 degrees, and we'll leave it peacefully for 3 weeks. And that helps for the protein that's in suspension, and also the yeast cells that are still in suspension in what is now the beer, to drop to the bottom of the tank, so that we can remove the sediment. Mm-hmm.
So there is no distillation process. It's basically one.
Well, there's the fermentation, which is the transformation of the sugar into alcohol, and then we have at the end of the fermentation, you'll have a very troubled. So there'll be lots of protein and lots of yeast cells in suspension. So the beer will be very, very. It won't be very clear at all. This is when I get to the point where I'm forgetting to speak English, but never mind. You speak too much French. So that's why you leave for a period of 3 weeks to let the beer clarify. And then after those 3 weeks, you can either put the beer into bottles. And once the beer is put into bottles, given that it's a beer that's unfiltered and unpasteurized, we then have a secondary fermentation in the bottles, which, as I've mentioned, allows you to generate the fizziness in the beer because of the CO2, the carbon dioxide that's produced during the secondary fermentation. Mm-hmm.
All right, so you make
so that we can get beer, as you can understand. I'm trying to go briefly over the top of it. It becomes very technical very quickly, and that's part of what makes beer making passionate. Is you're learning new things every single day. And that's part of the root of the project that we're working on at the moment. Mm-hmm.
I really hope one day we will organize an ex-culture symposium in France and maybe visit your brewery and see the process.
So do I. So do I.
So now the beer is made. It's different. It's craft. How do you sell it? What's your current distribution model?
Local. Very local. We work with very few intermediaries. So most of our sales are direct. I'd say 90% of our sales are direct to our resellers.
Or direct to restaurants?
So direct to bars, restaurants, shops, whether they be wine shops or beer shops, or to épiceries, so small supermarkets, specialist supermarkets. And then also you've got a whole supermarket sector, what we call here the GMS sector, mm-hmm. Which is the large, like the Walmarts or the big national brands, supermarket brands. And we work with a distributor for that, but that represents only 10% of our sales or thereabouts. Yeah. Mm.
Do you sell it in bottles, or does it come in kegs, or what's the?
About half our production goes out in bottles, and half goes out in kegs in normal times, in non-COVID times, yeah. Mm. Because during the COVID, things are very complicated because everything that was, we work with a lot of local event organizers here. And this summer, all the events were cancelled. So that we normally, I think in August, we normally have about 2,000 kegs going out. This August, I think we had 150 or something. So it was really, really not the same summer that we'd normally have.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah. But our focus, just perhaps what's interesting in the beer market, I know in the US, distribution of beer is the real important part of the whole process, because it's becoming more and more complicated than the US to have beer distributed. In France, there's still a notion of tied pubs and bars, whereby the bars will sign contracts with distributors who are in turn linked to industrial brewers, and therefore, they form those ties because there's a financial benefit for them in terms of getting help for setting up their bars or even restaurants, in terms of furniture, in terms of all the bar equipment, fridges, etc., etc. But in return, the distributors are looking for an engagement to buy only their products for a period of time that can be up to 7 years. Mm-hmm. And they are not allowed to buy any products from any other beer producers or beer suppliers. So the market can be quite difficult to get into. So our kegs go out more to the sort of the organizations, especially like NGOs who are organizing big events here. Probably some of your people listening to us at some point will have heard of the Fête de Bayonne. It's one of the biggest street festivals in the world, and now it's about 1 million people over a period of 4 days, and they drink a lot of beer, and we help supply a bit of it. Yeah. Mm.
Now let's talk a little bit about competition before we get into who your competitors are on the distribution side. So you're saying that many bars may have an exclusive agreement with the beer manufacturer. So it means that even if they wanted to buy your beer, they may not be allowed to do so, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So basically
exactly.
You have this sort of, there is this first mover advantage essentially. So whoever gets the most bars in the beginning, they sort of have a guaranteed distribution.
It's also financial muscle. I think in France, Heineken has lent, I think it's 250 million euros to bars. In other words, they've paid for a lot of equipment in the bars. We don't have that money. We cannot go into a bar, and we try. We work with some bars where we've installed equipment on a form of a long-term contract or purchase hire contract, but it is complicated because a lot of the big brewers will not worry about paying 5,000, 10,000 euros to set equipment up in a bar, and we just can't do that. We can't compete with them, or the terms in which that we try to use with those bars are unacceptable for them because they can't engage financially in the way that we ask them to. Mm.
Interesting. So in terms of competitors, then, who are your competition? Are there other craft breweries or
when I first set up the brewery in 2006, there were about 200 craft breweries in France. As you guys have seen in the US, there's been enormous expansion. The expansion in the US, I know lots of other markets as well, but it happened a lot before. It's happened in Europe and even in England. So now we're up to, I think the latest official count is about 1,800 breweries in France. And most of those are serving local markets. In this area, I've lost count of the number of breweries. There used to be just 2 of us, but I think now there are breweries that seem to set up every other week here. But they tend to be very small scale operations using very small scale brewing equipment. And for the moment, I wouldn't even consider them to be competition. Mm.
So
I think
so you don't see big brands like Heineken, Corona. They're not.
Oh yeah. We obviously have all that within the sort of what I would classify as being the sort of the industrial part of the market. The French market, for me, is separated into two elements. You have the 95% of the 95% of the beer consumed in France comes out of industrial breweries, and there's now about 5% that's coming out of independent or craft breweries. Mm-hmm. And most of those independent craft breweries will be operating in very local markets. Some have been able to break out of local markets and have a national distribution, but they tend to be very large breweries and have obviously contacts with distributors and also with national sales forces in order to be able to do that. Mm-hmm.
In terms of price, how does your price compare to those industrial producers? Is it much more expensive?
Yes. To give you an idea, I mean, we're looking at in terms of we have a VAT here, or the sales equivalent to sales tax in France here. If you remove that, we're looking at an average price to our clients of about just over €4 a litre. Mm-hmm. It's a good. I was just looking for something. If you see the industrial beers, they're willing to accept. I think it's what was it? They're willing to accept under €1 a litre.
That's how much the bar pays.
That's how much the consumer. That's how much the consumer. Yeah. So the difference is enormous. And in terms of, to give you an idea, we sell our bottles to consumers at around €2. 20. So it's really far lower. But Hello.
Yeah, I'm here. So for some reason we lost the connection for a second. So you were saying that, hello? Bob, is it connected? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, sorry, I lost your last sentence. Can you please maybe repeat that last thought?
Really good connection here.
Okay, it seems to be working now.
Okay.
So we were talking about the difference in price. You said that
Yeah.
$4 for the craft beer, but some industrial producers are willing to charge as little as $1, which seems to be very, very cheap to me for a liter.
Sorry, what I was saying, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
No, can you hear? Yeah, you can hear me.
Yeah.
I was saying that recently we found some promotions for industrial beer where they were selling their bottles at 28 cents a bottle, whereas our beers are sold.
Seems to be awfully cheap. I mean, I don't know what the prices are in Europe, but in the United States, it seems to me that, you know, like if you get a glass of beer at a bar, I mean, you're probably looking at least $4, $5, $6. I mean, shouldn't it be?
Yeah, no, sure, but I'm talking about supermarket trade at the moment. So I'm just looking at supermarket trade. So because a lot of the big industrial bureaus, they're hunting volume. They're not necessarily hunting margin. Well, their margins that they're expecting are much, much lower. We've got a completely different way of looking at the market, whereas we want to maximize margin with a good product. So it's a justified price. It's going to cost you. So our beers sold in supermarkets are sold at €2.70 a bottle against some beers that are sold at 28 centimes a bottle. So there's a big difference. And even when you look at our positioning compared to the 5% or the other craft breweries here, we're a lot more expensive. And and we sell.
So how do you deal with that? I mean, what's your marketing strategy? How do you survive in that ruthless competitive world?
We do our own thing. So it can, certainly with some elements, it can be hard. I mean, but we've developed a brand recognition. So the reason that we work in, for example, supermarkets is because the supermarkets want to have our product on their shelves, and because they know that consumers are looking for the product. So you can even say it's a consumer pull rather than a push from our point of view. But that's always within a local market, and it comes back to the project here, which is we need to find ways to expand people's awareness of our products outside the local market. And at the moment, our product and our brands have a very strong local identity. So that's just the whole idea of trying to set up a new range of products in order that we can start looking at how we can expand into regional and national markets.
So we will get to that in 1 second, because we really want to get a little bit more information from you as to what
Sure. Yeah.
But in terms of the current marketing, so do you do any advertisement or promotion, or do you just simply go from bar to bar and talk to them about your beer? Or how does it work?
We work very much, there's an expression in France which is bouche à l'oreille, c'est a word of mouth. So I spent a lot of, when I first started up the brewery, I went around and I went from bar to bar to bar trying to sell the beers and trying to tell people about what we were doing and the quality of our products. But I realized very quickly that I'd have to go into perhaps the same bar 4 or 5 times before they passed the first order. And that first order would possibly for 1 case of beer. So it took a huge amount of time. The returns were incredibly thin because of the time and the fact that the order levels were very, very low. So I have to admit that after a while, I abandoned all commercial activity or direct commercial activity, and I focused more on trying to get people to taste the product through the events that are organized here. So it's really looking at getting people to understand what we were doing, being quite present in the events so that people saw our branding, they got an idea of what the product was like, etc. It's a far longer process to do it that way. but I wasn't in a hurry and I couldn't go that quickly. I was by myself in the first years here, so I couldn't produce a huge amount of beer by myself. And I never set out to set up a multinational brewery. I always wanted to have something that remained quite strict to the sort of the values that I deem necessary for the brewery right at the outset.
All right.
I hope that makes sense. I hope that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense, and I know exactly what you mean. And this is a common problem for sort of small to medium-sized companies. I mean, it's not quite the, you know, the size and volume where you would advertise on TV, where the investment in big scale advertisement pays off. But at a small scale, yes, often.
Even if you can advertise on TV, because of the laws are becoming more and more restrictive in terms of alcohol advertising in a lot of countries. In France, there is absolutely no link between alcohol and sport now. That's been completely wiped off. But by word of mouth, by working with people who are actually serving our beer, being quite present, being very focused on service, which is a really important element of our product offering. It's helped us get into people's hands and into people's mouths and actually develop a reputation. A lot of people think we're a lot bigger than we actually are because they've seen our beer in big events here, they've enjoyed our beer in big events, they've seen it in bars, they've seen it in restaurants, which is great. So our brand is bigger than the reality.
How many people work for you at this time?
There's 6 of us, so it's really small business, yeah. Yeah.
Now, so we have a lot of students this semester, and I still don't have the information as to how many teams will choose your product, but I'm sure there will be some, and probably all around the world. So how can they help you? What would you like them to focus on? And obviously we have the instructions, and I assume most of them have read it already. So, but can you explain in your own words, what would be the most value to you? So they will be spending probably 5 to 10 hours per week for the next 2 months or so. And so ideally we want to direct that energy, that time into a sort of direction that will give you the most value. So what's the most interesting type of activities they should engage in?
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry, you can hear me. Yeah, sorry, it cuts off the whole time. Yeah, for me, the most important thing is, I think, comes back to the reason for this project, is that what we want to do is we want to find a novel way of doing 3 things, which is maintaining our passion and interest for developing new beers within the brewery, which are linked to our quality improvement programs. So that's the first thing. It's really an internal objective. But we know from talking, and we know brewers, quite a lot of brewers, we know whether they're home brewers or whether they're small brewers or whether they're people that love drinking beer, a lot of people want to taste beers that are unusual or different, with a story behind them. And we think that there's a way of actually selling beer to those people in regional and national markets. But we need to find a way of doing it in a very different way as well, as I keep saying, because we don't have the resources to have a national sales team. We don't want to have to work with national distributors, because if you work with a national distributor, even if the distributor wants to sell your products, and there are lots of people that want them to sell their products, you'll have very little money left at the end of the day. So the distributor will probably make more money than you're making. So what we want to do is to find a new way to market by developing a community whereby people can see how we're making the beers. They can become interested in the brewing, or more interested in the brewing process, the specifics of what we're doing, because it's actually quite specific in terms of the themes that we're going to be following in the new beers that we'll be creating. So it's involving them in a story, involving them in a process, which will then hopefully encourage them to actually buy some beers that come out of that. And there'll be very limited edition beers. So we'll be looking at having perhaps 2,000 bottles, 3,000 bottles the most, that will come out of each experimental brew. So it's really, really small scale. And the idea then is these people can buy, at the moment, these people can buy the beers through an e-commerce website, wherever they are, delivered to their homes so they can taste them, and then possibly to have, we can imagine all sorts of things. We can have guided tasting sessions, so we can have someone that will actually teach them how to taste the beers that they've just bought. And the other thing that we're quite keen to do with that is to try and reference the novel or the new beers that we're producing to the beers that we already produce. So looking at how we can actually get people to buy a case of beer, perhaps 12 bottles of beer, within which there will be some beers that are in our normal range of beers. So they can see the difference between our normal range of beers, which are high quality beers, and the more experimental beers. And that's, for us, it's almost like a sort of the Trojan horse. So in other words, is getting people interested in a product or a process more. So how do they make these beers? Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, they're using a really interesting yeast. They're whatever. There are lots of different things. And then so then they'll think, oh yes, I really want to buy these beers. They'll talk to other people, and the whole thing for us is how, and that's the big question for everyone, is how can we build a community within which we can nurture people's interest in beer, and at the back of it, perhaps help them get them to buy a few of the beers that are coming out of this program. Right. But I emphasize that what we're looking at doing is very small scale at the moment. If we can make it bigger scale in the future, so much the better. But in terms of the next three-year time horizon, our ambitions are not enormous for this product range, but it's really a way of trying to get people to talk about us outside the local area, and a way of generating brand awareness for the new range of products and also for the existing brewery outside our normal area of distribution. Because if we can do that, and this is where perhaps I'm a bit mad, if we can manage to do that, then people will beat a path to our door rather than us having to beat a path to their door. And in terms of opportunities for selling later, again, it comes back to investing in this word of mouth. And if people are looking for our beers, they can find them. Inbound marketing always sounds really, really sexy, but it's incredibly difficult to do well. And we're looking at doing something, so taking elements of that and saying, okay, well, let's launch a new range of products that has a very specific target market, and see if we can do something original and creative to get people talking about a range of products and buy them.
Very interesting. Yeah, so I guess building the community is the key, but it takes time. It's something that is not so easy to do.
But that's where we're looking at sort of getting ideas, and there are millions of ideas that come out of it, but it's ideas that are focused on quite a specialist marketplace as well. So as the ideas I put in the project document was looking at how we can and we're already doing it at the moment, is building links with industry suppliers, with laboratories, with beer specialists, so that we have an even bigger story to tell. And of course, all those people, it's this idea of this concentric community. So we can tap into lots of other communities, and lots of other communities can tap into us as well. Yeah, if we can build something that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if, I know like wine producers, for example, they're very big on sort of winery tours, attracting tourists or locals, showing how they make wine.
Yeah.
Something that can be done also with beer? Or the
no, sure. I spent, this summer, I spent an awful lot of time welcoming people to visit the brewery, or certainly our main focus in the visits is to teach people about how you make beer, because the majority of people have no idea how beer is made.
I didn't.
Yeah. And that's what's really interesting, because people always walk out and go, oh, I didn't know that before I came here. And that gives them, as you were saying before, in terms of an interest in the product and an interest in finding out more about the product. It's fantastic. I think the project we're working on now is probably, we're trying to preach to the converted. So in other words, the people that already know a fair amount of beer, already tasting beers that are well outside the sort of the norms of industrial beers, and looking at how we can get them to to join us on a trip in producing beers that are certainly far less normal than the most of the beers, the craft beers that people are drinking.
One more thing I would recommend the students do is, I assume at least in the United States, Canada, but probably most European countries, I know most of the towns have a local brewery or several of them, craft beer.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it would be a good idea to maybe visit them and talk to the owners and see what they do. I suppose it
Sorry. Are you suggesting that students go and drink beer in a brewery?
Well, I'm suggesting they talk to the founders. Well, maybe sample. But also, I think it may be a good idea to sort of interview local craft beer producers,
Sure.
and see what they do. Maybe they have some ideas that can be also implemented in France.
I think there would be from a cultural perspective, because there are big differences. If you take the US market in terms of the state by state differences in alcohol laws and distribution of alcohol, they're enormous. And what you can do in one state, you certainly can't do in another state. And I think where we are...
How regulated is it in France? I mean, do you need to get some like special licenses, certifications? How is it?
My impression is that it's actually a lot easier to do business in France as a craft brewery than it is in the States. A lot easier. And we can sell our beer anywhere we want in France, no problem at all. It's obviously not, it's the same country, it's not a federation of states, but I mean, even if you want to send our beer into other countries, obviously there are some problems with the excise duties on alcohol going across frontiers, even within the European community. But there are not massive problems to selling beer wherever we want.
Well, there is more information about the company and the questions in the report, but there is another set of questions that I wanted to ask students, ask it all the time. So you are today where our students want to be, say, in 15 years. So most of our students are MBA students or business majors. And so the vast majority, we've done surveys, the vast majority of them would like to start their own business. Any words of advice or wisdom on first, is it even worth to try to build your own business? Maybe it's just better to have an 8 to 5 job and not worry about distribution, payroll. And
well, I think the response you're going to get from me, which is that I've done, and I've never worked an 8 till 5 job. I've always worked an 8 till 8 or an 8 till midnight job. I've never, even when I was working for big companies, for me, the entrepreneur, being an entrepreneur is fantastic. The one thing that you miss immediately at becoming an entrepreneur is a guaranteed wage check at the end of the month. But that's part of it. That's part of the rush. That's part of the joy of doing it. Your own boss. You can do what you like. You're not having to go through a legion of accountants or lawyers in your company to get ideas off the ground. You've got an idea. You want to go with it. You go with it.
So with all
sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Yeah. Yeah.
So with all that stress, uncertainty, responsibility, if you could go back in time, you wouldn't trade your career for a job at a respectable company from 8 till 5.
Well, I've done that, and I think as I said, there's some bits. It would have been nice to have a lot more financial security, which I would have got if I stayed within a multinational company, which is what I was working for before. But at the end of the day, I'm really pleased with what I managed to create here. And in terms of setting up a small brewery in an area which has a low population density and making it work, I think it's pretty good. I'm really pleased with that. I wholeheartedly encourage people to look at setting up their own businesses. I think the one thing that you really have to be aware of is the fact that there is no easy way to make money. And it comes down to having a good idea, being really willing to graft, to work really, really hard to get your idea off the ground and making it work. And as I see a lot of people coming here who want to set up breweries, and I'm probably considered to be a bit of a dream piercer, because I give them a reality check, and I say to them, look, when I first started out here, I was working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, you know, I said to them, yeah, and I was earning what a checkout assistant in a supermarket would earn in Vietnam. Yeah, so not much at all, but now it's fine. I mean, we're making money, we're making good profits, etc. But it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy to set up a business, and you have to have the willingness to sacrifice quite a lot in order to sell any form of business, I think, personally.
Any mistakes you made that you know, if you could go back in time, anything you would do differently?
Ooh, very good question. Very good question. I think always the question to come back to is looking at how we could have, and I think I'll respond in a slightly different way. When I first set out my business plan for the brewery, I projected a certain level of sales up to 2 years. And the way I did my sales forecast was incredibly logical, based on a certain number of new clients every period, an increase in sales with the clients over a period of time. To me, it seemed perfectly logical. We achieved that sales figure after 6 years.
Well, you know,
yeah.
hardly any.
And I think that's probably the learning I got from that. There are other breweries here in France that have managed to go from nothing to being 4 times the size of me, or the brewery we got here, in far less time. But that all comes down to how you're willing to sell your beer, and that can make a very big difference to the progress that you can make within a brewery.
Very interesting. All right, I think we've covered everything that we needed to, and we usually aim at about 45 minutes.
Okay, cool.
Questions, you can always email them to us. So what we do, we know that you're very, very busy as a company owner, as a manager. So what we do to minimize your workload is that when the question is new and we don't have the answer, we will send it to you and ask you to maybe provide more information by email. But if it is the question that we either answered in the webinar, or maybe we know the answer from the previous sort of, you know, correspondence, then we just copy and paste the answer and send it to student without bothering.
Cool.
So there will be probably some questions in the first week or two. Then students will be working on the reports. It will be relatively quiet. And then there will be probably more questions towards the end of the semester, so late November. Yeah. So, but for now, it looks like we have enough information. So I recorded the meeting, so we'll be able to watch it then. And yeah, thank you so much. Very, very informative. So I hope that the travel ban is lifted soon, and we will be able to maybe visit you sometime in France and see for ourselves how the beer is.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. No, have a good day. I'm going to go home now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night. I think it's what, 6 p.m., 8 p.m., 7 p.m., 7 p.m.
Yeah,
right?
7 p.m. Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.